Hello again, good afternoon, and welcome back to Digital Transformation 2020. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's session again. Now, we touched on this earlier this morning, but over the last decade, we've really seen a significant shift in customer attitudes. You know, they're more concerned about things like brand values and trust and ethical responsibility and stuff that perhaps 10 years ago would have seemed very strange and very odd. But, you know, it is becoming front and centre now. This closing session will explore how business is responding to that and how technology and transformation can be used to basically improve sustainability. Our first speaker this afternoon is Betsy Reed, author and sustainability strategist. And she's going to be looking at how you actually kind of build it into the fabric of your business. So Betsy, over to you.
Well, it's good to be here today. Thank you for that introduction. I'll say a little bit more about myself. So I lived and worked in Scotland for 9 years. So I moved there to study and knew I wanted to stay. So I know the landscape quite well. And it's a place I still love to work because it's a place where you can make things happen, particularly on sustainability and innovation. So it's a real delight to get to speak to the delegates today and anybody watching this in future. I recently published my first book, which is called Communicating Social and Environmental Issues Effectively, which is, clues in the name, but the interesting process of writing that and then having it come out in July 2020 was that we had absolutely no idea what this year would hold. And from my perspective as a lifelong, career-long sustainability person, we're having a moment. We're having a moment that's not going to go away. And whereas in 2008 with the financial crisis, sustainability, meaning social and environmental sustainability, was often the first agenda to get cut, the budget to get cut. We're definitely not seeing that happen this time around. So with the sort of tsunami of social issues and climate change awareness, actually, this is something that it's really not a tough sell anymore. I can say the term climate crisis and not have to be prepared to defend my position. So it is a pleasure to get to talk to people in the digital scene about this, because actually they are in the vanguard of potentially coming up with innovations that are going to help us as a society kind of survive what's going on right now. So the potential is very exciting. And I know that those who've watched the sessions this morning have heard a lot about things like trends shaping our future, innovation, impact, all that stuff. So let's go into my slides. Here we go. So this is me. I've introduced myself. Let's talk about embedding sustainability strategy. So obviously I've covered that this is really important for everybody, no matter what your sector, no matter who you are. And I think it's going to be very apparent that this is not a trend that's going to go away anytime soon. So let's just move on quickly. I like to get everybody on the same page whenever I start talking about sustainability. And it's really important to understand that this is a classic, the Brundtland definition that came out in the 80s, and it's still the definition that everyone goes by, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it's really important to remember that sustainability isn't just environmental things. It's not just carbon or energy or waste. It's also about social impact. And for me personally, that is what has motivated me to be in these issues my entire career. It's the human impact, because I love bees, I love trees, but the reason is because we as humans need those things in order to survive. We need a functioning ecosystem. And you might see some cataclysmic headlines about impending ecosystem collapse. And I think those are actually really stark reminders that we all need to be sustainability people. So let's move on and look at what it is more specifically. So obviously with social sustainability, it's about human rights, gender equality, racial equality, sustainable livelihoods, meaning the person who grew the coffee you're drinking is paid enough to continue to live and educate their children and have a life that isn't just scraping by. And then on the environmental side, things that you'll know well, like climate change, carbon, which comes up a lot, obviously, in digital, waste, packaging, things like that. So it's kind of obvious. So let's move on to talking about some of the overarching trends. So looking at this slide, you'll see at the center, we've got social movements, climate crisis, and COVID, because it is definitely a thing and it's not a thing that's going away. So the World Economic Forum identified extreme weather events and the failure of climate change mitigation because we have not kept pace with those big, juicy Millennium Development Goals that we were supposed to all meet by 2020. And we're seeing quicker and quicker climate crisis. So adaptation, and the World Economic Forum listed climate change as one of the top risks to survival, to humanity, to business in its 2019 Global Risks Report. So obviously COVID has been an interesting one and we're still in the midst of it. I'm talking to you today from Barcelona. We've had some pretty intense lockdowns. We're facing potentially another one. But what it's done is I'm speaking to you from my house. It's brought the professional and the personal together in a really interesting way. It's probably forever changed the way we work, the way we relate, the fact that we're all logging into this event remotely today. And also it's changed our sense of personal safety. So when you think walking down the street, anyone could be a biological weapon, it does sort of tend to fragment people. And on the other hand, it's also brought us together because we all have access to each other. As somebody who lives and works here in Spain, but works all over the world, particularly in the UK quite a lot, it has leveled access to talents. It has maybe given people who might not have had access to great jobs in urban centers that they couldn't afford to live in, access to career possibilities. So there might be an impact on equality and diversity, which is also a sustainability issue. And we don't even know how this is going to impact the economy in future, both in terms of opportunities and risks. And then we've got social movements. So obviously you have to have been living under a rock not to be aware of things like Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, which is a climate change movement, but it's also a social movement. It has activated, well, lots of these issues have activated people who never would have before thought of themselves as activists. And that then feeds into this wider orbit of trends that you see on this slide, like activism, like the fact that people like my mother are getting involved. People's grandmothers are out protesting police brutality in places like the US. People's, sort of granny are doing things like gluing themselves to trains in the UK to protest climate change. We're seeing young people more activated, and that feeds into public expectations, what people expect of brands and services and who they want to work for has changed. And there's study after study, trend report after trend report showing that people want to be able to trust the brands, the organizations they work for, the things they buy, the places they go. They want to know that they're doing something positive for society and the environment. And that impacts business models. That impacts shareholder value. That impacts reputation and risk. So that's not to be underestimated. And then you see things here like regulation. Obviously, there are more and more regulations around issues like climate change, but there are also things around freedom of movements. If you think about Brexit, we don't know what's going to happen with freedom of movement around Europe. Obviously, we're seeing an impact on global movement of goods and services and people with COVID. And then we have information. This is a really key one, particularly for you in this audience, because digital tech space, it's all kind of about information and access to each other, access to information, and we're facing a crisis of trust in information. So with the onslaught of fake news, people don't know who to trust, people are living in fear, people are more polarized than ever before. And this is obviously a big issue to address through greater transparency and in relation to what I'm going to talk about here, which is sustainability strategy, the legitimacy of action, because the way to trust information that you're reading is to be able to then look to see what an organization, for example, is actually doing about what they're saying they're doing. So that's really important in terms of information. And then that feeds right into that bubble that says purpose. So trends have shown, lots of trends have shown what I talked about with public expectations. People expect organizations that they work for, that they buy from, that they hear information from, to be driven by purpose. And they are more likely to choose brands, services, alliances, be loyal to things that have purpose at the heart. And that is about having a positive impact on society and the environment. So we're seeing that through things like Certified B Corp, which started in the US, is really growing in the UK and is spreading all around the world. But people want to be able to see that whoever they're buying from or working for or loyal to has something that indicates that they have purpose at their core. And this is not going to go away anytime soon. So let's move on to risks and rewards. Let's see if my my attempted animation on this slide is working. It doesn't seem to be. So my point on this slide is they're the same thing, risks and rewards. If I could get anybody to help me with that slide and pop up the two columns, I'll just read them through. They are reputation, customers, employees, and impact. Thank you. So basically you can see, actually, I'm seeing this more and more because in my role as a sustainability advisor to corporates and governments, they are the same thing. And I get called in to advise people on reputation management, which then obviously feeds into, if they want to grow their customer base based on those trends I just talked about, they need to be working with purpose. And then obviously employees, especially with millennials, but actually with all ages, people want to work for somebody they believe in and can trust. And then impact, it's about having a positive impact on society or environment. And the simple headline to remember with that is, if you're doing it not so well, if you haven't thought about it in your strategy, you're creating risk. If you are doing it well, if you're tackling it, or if you're trying to improve your performance, your strategy, your approach to all of this, you have potential rewards in store in terms of reputation, growth of customers, loyalty, employee recruitment and retention. Consider the fact that Unilever, which is a huge fast-moving consumer goods company, is consistently named as the top company that millennials want to work for. They are not sexy on the face of it. They make Knorr soup cubes and dog food and Dove products. But because they have taken a real stance, a really strong stance on their sustainability activities, people want to work for them. They trust them. And then finally on impact, obviously, that's a huge reward. If people see that you're actually doing what you say you're going to do, they trust you more. Let's move on. Let's talk about how you can embed strategy on social and environmental issues, and why actually this holistic view of social and environmental, or sustainability 2.0, is critical to thriving as a business in this day and age in light of pressures like climate change and social movements. So how do you set strategy? This is a no-brainer. You're not going to see anything here that you've not seen before. The what? Obviously, a relevant, bespoke, stretching approach that talks about, it deals with your activity that has a social or environmental impact. And that can be internal, external, ideally both. And then who? This is one where I see people skip a step quite a lot. Obviously, there needs to be leadership from the top on this, but there also needs to be buy-in at all levels. Don't forget that, particularly with these issues. There are people in your organization, or maybe outside your organization, who need to be your customers, or just are key stakeholders of some sort, who need to be bought into this approach and might actually also bring a really valuable perspective. So I talk about building consensus through consultation, and actually it's a really critical way of embedding this. If you have operations people, they need to deliver this strategy, so they should be involved in it. And a point that I really want to make strongly, I judge an organization by how early they bring their communications people into the strategy process. So those who just kind of do what they need to do and then at the end tell their communications people, well, just calms this, are missing a real trick. Actually, communications people are often the ones who are the eyes out into the external landscape to bring those perspectives in, to manage risk and reputation, and to help embed that into strategy is absolutely brilliant. So I see the organizations who are doing sustainability strategy well, involving their communications people, maybe having a chief communications officer, involving it at C-suite level, but also understanding that all of their leaders need to be able to communicate effectively about these issues. So they need to understand them, no matter what their role is. So that's going to feed into strategy. And then finally, the how, we'll just cover this in the next slide. So let's move on. I'm running out of time. I have so much to say. So how do you measure success? This is basically feeding into, obviously, when you set strategy, you're considering this. KPIs can often be tricky around social and environmental issues. All I'm going to say about this is don't get stuck just measuring environmental stuff. Carbon or energy or waste. Those are kind of the easy no-brainer things. They're also often quite easy to measure. Grapple with the trickier stuff too. How are you engaging your key stakeholders? You see engagement on that slide. How are you actually changing habits and attitudes? How are you challenging your competitors to do better? I mean, and how much are you communicating about it? How are you building trust in your brand? These are really important things to consider in your KPIs. They're not easy, but they should be in there. And then this is a real opportunity. So make sure you're engaging the right people, and make sure you're transparent, because those who aren't transparent are going to struggle to survive in this new paradigm in which we find ourselves, with climate crisis, with COVID, with activism, just part of daily life. And then what next? Make sure you keep going. Review how you're doing. Be transparent about it. If you're not maybe meeting your targets in some area, people trust you if you actually admit that. And then set yourself more stretching targets. This is not a time to make this a tick box exercise. It's not optional anymore. You have to keep going because you have to keep up with trends like climate change and trust issues. So we're almost at the end here. Just to sum it up very quickly, and obviously I'm really keen on hearing any questions that people watching this have. Sustainability 2.0 is holistic. It's about social and environmental issues, and you need to remember that. Those who don't are the people that I think, oh, how 2003 of you. Doing it well is no longer an option. You have to do it well. This is critical to survival as a business now and in the future. And actually, don't wait for government to take charge. They're catching up, honestly. The hand of business leaders has been forced by these trends, and those who just want to survive and leave a decent legacy are trying to outpace these really key pressures we've talked about. And then finally, remember, risks are the same as the potential rewards. So when you assess a risk, flip it and see what the reward can be, because they're there. A strategic approach involves everyone from leadership all the way down. Engagement and transparency are critical to your reputation, but also to your own internal learning, so you improve your approach. Make sure you measure success so you know what's going on, and then keep going. And then, excuse me, finally leaving you with this. I love this sign. So you see this all over in the US. I saw this when I was last home last year, which is all of these issues are sustainability. Love is love. Black Lives Matter, science is real. Feminism is for everyone. No human is illegal, and kindness is everything. So all of these issues remind us to actually be human in our work as well, because our instincts as humans are also great for helping us to assess risk and set strategy that involves other people and makes us more effective and helps us to understand how other people see us. So with that, I will leave you. Thank you so much.
Betsy, thank you very much for that. Betsy Reed. And if you're trying to time a presentation, it's a really clever idea, living beside an 18th century Spanish church with a clock tower. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. If you have any questions for Betsy, or indeed any of our three speakers in this session, then you go to the question section at the bottom of your screen and just whack it in there, and I'll try and get through as many as I can after everybody's actually spoken. Our next speaker is Iain Dugan, who's head of IT for SSE. And this is a very modest claim. This is delivering digital transformation to save the planet. Iain.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Ray for having me. I feel like, to quote a caller in a football phone-in, I'm a first-time caller, long-time listener. So hoping to kind of maintain the high standard of the presentations we've seen today. So I'm going to be talking about delivering digital transformation for a higher purpose, in this case, to save the planet, as you say, a modest ambition. So I'm going to go through who SSE are and who SSE Transmission are, which is the bit of SSE that I work in. Look at where we've been today and a kind of, I guess, the very real burning platform that we exist on, that's forcing us to change. And then how that links to our digital transformation journey and what we're going to do for really the next 5 years in our next sort of regulatory pricing period. So SSE is no longer the people that you pay your direct debit to for electricity or gas, and it's no longer the people who sponsor the hydro. That was the sort of energy supply business, and actually SSE has sold that off to OVO now. So although that's branded that way, OVO will get rid of that brand in time. So SSE is really now a renewable energy company and distributor. So it's focused on clean electricity. And we develop, own and operate low carbon infrastructure that ultimately supports the zero carbon transition that's needed both in Great Britain and Ireland and for the planet as a whole. So we've got lots of the wind turbines both on and offshore, hydroelectric schemes. We own the transmission networks and the distribution networks, And then we've also got some efficient gas plants and some energy waste plants that we're just about to sell off. So as I say, I work for the transmission business, and I guess just to give a bit of an overview of what transmission is. Basically, transmission is like the motorway and A roads for electricity. So the challenge that Great Britain has is that there is lots of renewable energy generation and the potential for lots more, mainly focused in the north of Scotland. And you'll appreciate that the population centres in Great Britain are not in the north of Scotland. So we have to take that electricity and get it into the places that really need it. So that's taking it down to the central belt of Scotland, then down to the M62 belt. And once you're below that, there's actually very little generation at the minute. So it's a real challenge to get that electricity to where it needs to go. So transmission is like the motorways and the A roads. You've also got the distribution network, which is the low voltage network. That's a bit like the B roads and the unclassified roads that would get electricity to your house. So as I say, SSE Transmission are the transmission operator in the north of Scotland. And that's an area the size of Belgium, which creates its own sort of set of interesting challenges as you try to move a workforce around it in the middle of winter. So this is what we do. If you've ever driven up the A9 from Perth to Inverness, you'll have seen our handiwork. This is the Corriaric Pass, and it's part of the Beaulieu to Denny line, which pretty much runs parallel to the A9. It's some of the most inhospitable environments in Scotland that we have to put infrastructure up that has to be as close to 100% reliable as possible. So if you have faults in the electricity networks, they tend to be distribution faults. A small transformer or a line has gone down. If we have an issue, then and the redundancy doesn't kick in, then you're talking about significant portions of the country being out. So we have to build for reliability. And as I say, it really is inhospitable. So this is Melgarve, and somewhere in the background there is a transmission line. So feet of snow, and having to develop and operate the transmission network that's there. So up until, I guess, about 2018, transmission was a projects organisation, and a really good one. It did capital projects. It got them, hundreds of millions of pounds. Beaulieu to Denny is probably one of the biggest infrastructure projects of its kind in Scotland at that point, and delivering them all to time, cost, and quality standards. As a result, the wider sort of organisational capabilities and any investment in corporate services, including IT, was almost non-existent. It was a project organisation. It went from one project to the next, and wasn't really an enterprise. So what's changed? And I guess Betsy has sort of laid some of this context. But the world is on fire, and in some cases quite literally. We do get wildfires in our patch. Thankfully, nothing in the scale of what was happening in America earlier this year or Australia. But climate change is a key factor. And catastrophic wildfires appear to be something that's here to stay. And likewise, climate change is making the countries wetter, and we're seeing serious flooding and much more often. So sort of once in a lifetime floods are now happening maybe once every 10 years. So really significant. And that's leading governments to declare a climate emergency. And Betsy was talking about Extinction Rebellion, and the UK is aiming to achieve net zero. So effectively, taking the carbon out of our economy by 2050. People don't necessarily think that goes far enough. Scotland are aiming for 2045. But this year, and particularly into next year, so there's a big event on Tuesday, that has a really serious implication for the climate emergency in terms of the US elections, because if Trump doesn't get in, there's a chance to kind of reset that climate agenda ahead of COP21 next year in Glasgow. So for Scotland, the decarbonisation of heat and transport, that's really what our net zero journey is about. And as I said, the challenge is that we've got lots of generation in the north of Scotland and lots of consumption further south of that, which means that we need to reinforce and build new motorways, if you like, to get that electricity where it needs to get to. We've made good progress on this in Scotland. So broadly speaking, in the north of Scotland, electricity is effectively decarbonised. You know, you'll see wind turbines, you'll see transmission and distribution lines. So that power is clean. The challenge is, how do we get that to the rest of Great Britain? So this has taken transmission onto our sort of core purpose. And we need to deliver a network for net zero. So we're a regulated business. We work in a 5-year price control period. So our next price control period is due to start in April. And essentially, we need to start delivering that network for net zero and building an electricity network that's scaled to transport 10 gigawatts of renewable energy from the north of Scotland to the population centres where it's needed in Great Britain by 2026. That's an investment of £2.4 billion over the next 5 years, which is an astronomical amount of money. And we talk about that being the certain view. That certain view is not the net zero view. So to get to net zero, there is potentially another £1 billion of investment that's needed. So I guess the big change that's happened in transmission is now that is also being underpinned by funding for digital transformation. So we have a £50 million investment plan for the next 5 years to get us on the path to enabling net zero for Great Britain. Now, depending on what organisation you come from, £50 million might not be a lot of money. It might be a huge amount of money. But transmission, until this year, we're spending almost nothing on IT. So this is a very significant investment for us. So, as I said, transmission, we are a regulated business. It's a technical monopoly. You can't just go and build your own pylons and start to transport electricity. So what Ofgem think is really pretty critical. So in 2019, Ofgem asked all of the transmission and distribution operators to publish a digital strategy. And their view is that, you know what, you've got some nice ideas, but realistically, guys, you're way behind the curve. And in order to kind of make sure that we catch up to where we need to do, Ofgem are actually introducing a license condition for us that we have to deliver against our digital strategy and action plan effectively to stay in business. So digital transformation for transmission is no longer a nice to have. We actually need to do it to stay in business, which sometimes if you're wanting to build a business case for digital transformation is sort of no bad thing. So, as I say, recognising that we're sort of behind the curve, it does create a set of opportunities and threats. So actually, we have a green field. We don't have a legacy of on-premise technology that we need to migrate away from or that's going to constrain our agility. And we've actually got the ability to take the lessons learned from others. And broadly speaking, we're in the same place as the other people in our industry. But there's lots of lessons learned that we can take from similar industries, oil and gas as an example, to show us how to get digital transformation right and use that as an accelerator to get to our goals faster. Talk there about, digital is really being driven cross-functionally. So we're working hand in glove with the business. This isn't about IT delivering something to them. This is, being on the journey together. And we're also able to leverage central investments. So because we're that bit behind the curve, things like a really nice Microsoft data and analytics platform is there for us to start to populate our data onto and drive value from. And one of the key things, and again, Betsy referred to this a bit earlier, but actually our sort of core purpose and the sort of having a net zero secure role is a really compelling argument at the minute. And actually we're seeing lots of attraction from oil and gas into SSE. And I think that's only going to continue as the two industries move forward. So threats. I think a lot of this is about the nature of the transmission business. So just to give you an idea, a large project for transmission might cost £500 million and take 10 years to deliver end to end. So, a business that has to plan on a 30-year horizon. So we know, broadly speaking, what our network looks like in 2050, and challenging them to come on a journey to deliver value in 30 days is a bit of a culture shock for them. As well, any sort of fail fast culture in an organisation where you're having to deliver assets that need to be 100% reliable, it doesn't, it really does jar. So we're having to work through that. And I guess we've got the opportunity with staff moving in, but actually our culture and our staff proposition needs to be equivalent of what people were experiencing in oil and gas. Otherwise, we're not going to retain people. So this is our, it's a digital transformation conference, so why not show a big architectural picture? But this is what we're on with for the next 5 years. This is what our £50 million plan is going to give us by 2026. It's ultimately a data play. We're an asset management business and a large capital projects delivery business. Our assets are worth about £3.5 billion. We're going to deliver £2.5 billion of projects. So actually, we're not going to go and drive huge efficiencies out of our field force. But if we could take 1% out of our asset management base, then you're talking really significant numbers. So working from left to right, we're going to be doing lots of work to kind of reinforce our OT network and upgrading our SCADA systems. And then moving on to sort of our sources of data and either implementing new applications or upgrading what we have, so that we've got modern, agile, cloud-based applications to provide the functions that we need. And then we need to really democratize that data into our central data lake and to enable us to start to drive value from across those data silos that exist at the minute. So our teams don't use their own data terribly well just now. Actually, we want them in the future to be able to use each other's data to really drive that value. And ultimately, we want that to deliver for our staff, for our stakeholders, for external as well, because of open data. We want that right data on the right device at the right time. And as well as that, we've got a significant investment in cyber resilience that we have to deliver. The operational technology network that we run is a very critically sensitive piece of infrastructure for the country. So we need to make sure that is taken care of as well. Okay. So just to talk about what we're doing in asset management and transformation. So as I say, we manage £3.5 billion worth of assets at the minute, and we'll be adding £1.5 billion more by the end of 2026. So we're looking to kind of create an asset management ecosystem that really allows us to control that asset data into a single source of truth, that ultimately allows us to drive value for at the minute and into our future regulatory period. So we're upgrading our Maximal instance, and we're also implementing a best-in-class GIS to help to visualize that data. And this is kind of where being behind the curve isn't too bad a thing. So if we look at a sort of similar, another department in SSE who delivered a GIS, took them a couple of years and about £15 million. We're going to be realizing value within 3 months for about £1 million investment. So technology has moved on so far that actually we can do this better and cheaper than people that have come before us. And our sort of T2 plan was, this regulatory period that's coming up was pretty manually intensive. We want our T3 plan to be fully data driven, and so that we can have it essentially at the tips of our fingers. Just finally want to show, I've talked about some of the big projects that we've got on the go, but actually we need to make sure that we drive this sort of much more agile mindset and discovery projects as well. And this is something that we're doing in relation to visual analytics. So the photos that you see have been taken by drones, and we're utilizing the algorithms to essentially be able to do what we would normally do manually through telling the conditions of those assets. Safety is our number one goal, and up there with sustainability as well. And we work in a very dangerous environment. It's high voltage electricity. It's geographically far away. It's bad weather conditions. So the more that we can utilize things like drones to take these rather than sending people up, it's essentially saving lives. So just to come to the benefits of what we're doing within digital transformation, we're going to democratize data. We're going to enable innovation within it and start to drive value from across what is currently in silos. We will improve the efficiency of our working practices and modernize them so that we've got a very compelling staff journey for people coming into the business. We will, be able to make these investment decisions and drive a digitally driven T3 plan. And ultimately, all of these things enable transmission to deliver a network for net zero that is required if we're going to meet the 2045 targets. So yeah, in conclusion, if the UK wants to meet its net zero targets, we've got to deliver billions of pounds of investment in the next price control to get that electricity generation in the north down to the south. And digital transformation is going to play a really key role in enabling that. So hopefully that is proven that we are delivering digital transformation to save the planet. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Iain. Thanks for that presentation. That's an awful lot of money you were talking about there. Iain Dugan, Head of IT for SSE. Our final speaker of today is Michael Groves. Michael is CEO of Topolytics, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Bindustrial Revolution, the Bi-Industrial Revolution, not entirely certain. Either way, Michael, if you could take over from here, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I think we're talking about here the Bindustrial Revolution. So you had it right the first time. So really I'm going to talk about waste, which actually, contrary to popular opinion, is actually quite difficult to measure and is difficult to manage if we want to get the outcomes for that material that we really desire, i.e. turn that material into a resource. And if that's going to feed into our corporate sustainability strategies, because sustainability was defined as the triple bottom line almost 30 years ago now. So both the social, environmental, and the economic aspects of the way a company operates. And so I'm going to take you back to almost 30 years ago when somebody said to me, "Well, Michael, what sort of job would you like to do?" And I kind of turned around and said, "Well, I'd quite like to work in environmental management." And they sort of thought about it for a second, kind of leaned over towards me and said, "Sonny, I think you should go and get yourself a proper job." So I think things have moved on a bit since then. And certainly I ignored that advice and basically I've spent pretty well the last sort of 20, 25 years working in and around environmental management, sustainability, and initially at least running around Southeast Asia, or auditing sustainable forest management. So going into these tropical forest concessions across Southeast Asia and kind of checking on how they were sort of managing the forestry and the logging operations to meet sustainability, third-party sustainability criteria. So this was my view on a sort of pretty well a daily basis, kind of running around in sort of ancient Toyota Land Cruisers and visiting kind of logging sites, this one in Borneo. But occasionally, would have a day off and one would head to the beach. And too often one would find things like this. So you'd find sort of tide lines of plastic bottles, flip-flops, and other detritus. And, and that got me thinking, well, where on earth did all this material come from? How on earth has all this material, man-made material, ended up in these kind of beautiful, remote, sort of previously pristine locations? And I guess that really sort of was my initial sort of start to think about waste and where it comes from, what it is, what happens to it. And that's why, as Topolytics, as a company, that's what we sort of focus in on. And why do that? Why is it such a problem? And why should we sort of take it more seriously? Well, if we take the sort of World Bank figures, as you can see here, the volume of that material that's being produced sort of pretty well globally, particularly in our sort of cities and towns and urban environments, is increasing. And over the next sort of 20, 30 years, the quantum is just going to grow. And it's a problem that we have to deal with it. We have to sort of get to grips with that growing amount of material that's basically being pushed out into what you might think of as a downstream kind of material supply chain. So we have to deal with that problem because it's a growing one. Now, the moment, clearly there is there is an industry, there is a process, there are companies, there are organizations that will deal with that material, will move that material, will take that material away, do something to that material. But on a global basis, more than 60% of the material that we're generating in our cities and our towns in particular is still ending up in a landfill site or a waste dump, or, of course, even worse, leaking into the environment. And that clearly presents an environmental kind of problem, but clearly it's also a social problem, huge social issues with what happens to that material, the pollution that generates. And so again, the outcomes are currently not very good for that material. And yet, that material all has a value, whether it's a monetary value, whether it's a value to a company that's processing or moving that material. There is value to be gained in handling and processing and improving the outcomes for all of that material on a global basis. And of course, what's also happening at the moment is, and I noticed one of the questions refers to this, is the idea of the circular economy. The idea that we shouldn't be throwing these materials away in a linear fashion. We sort of make products, we make packaging, we use it, and then basically we dispose of it. The idea that we should be designing those products and designing that packaging to be reused, to be remanufactured, and to be brought back into the production economy. So we shouldn't be sort of just basically chucking it away. So there's a lot of pressure now on companies and on governments to sort of take another look at the idea of waste and actually really, really take the idea of waste as a resource and zero waste as a kind of serious construct. And that is we think is a really important part of the overall triple bottom line. So that's why, Topolytics, we've set out our stall to make the world's waste visible. Then we can make it more verifiable and build trust in the data. And then ultimately what we can then do is drive value from that material, which is great. And it does sound really, it sounds really straightforward. But I think one of the challenges with looking at waste is not a simple thing to measure. It's not a simple thing to define. It's a very, very complex kind of system of different sort of commercial and non-commercial players, regulators, materials, and it moves. All of that material that we're generating in our shops and our factories, our offices, our homes, it's being moved from those locations into this system. And in the system, things happen to that material. But it doesn't just go from A to B. It might go from A to B to C to D. And it goes through a whole series of transformations. It gets mixed with other material. And that generates complexity. And that system and that complex system is the one that we are trying to make much more visible because it isn't particularly opaque at the moment. But we think by making it more transparent to all the players in the system, we can actually unlock some of the value in that material, and we can reduce some of those sort of environmental and kind of social kind of impacts attached to that. But like a lot, it's already been referenced today, finding that source of the truth is difficult. So that's why we think the only way to look at this problem is through no single lens, if you like. So we sort of triangulate on three things. So we understand the waste industry. We have people that have run waste management companies and recycling companies. So we know the way the industry works. That's our domain. And then we bring in cutting edge software and data science, and we put those three together. And that's basically how we can start to make that system more visible and improve the level of confidence that we have in the data on what that material is, how much of that material is there, and what happens to that material. And that requires us to look at a whole range of different sort of data inputs. And so like most things in life, there's no single source of the truth. And it's absolutely the case when it comes to waste and byproducts and industrial byproducts. So we think you have to look at it from a whole range of different angles, of the whole range of different data sets, whether it be kind of spreadsheets on the one hand, or whether it be sensors on the other. There is another pun, if you like, the internet of bins. So increasingly, you've got sensors being attached to bins and other assets that are kind of processing or moving waste material. So we think really that's where the technology piece can play a huge kind of part in actually making that system work better. So that's really what we're trying to do. And we're taking that approach into some work with the UK government at the moment, which is basically mandated that all waste across the UK will be digitally tracked. So a digital kind of smart waste tracking system. So we've taken that approach and we're applying that to that particular challenge for the regulators, because all waste is a regulated industry in pretty well most countries. So the regulators are now starting to sort of see, can we get a better view over what's happening to that material in order to improve policies around circular economy, around climate change, and also reduce waste crime. But this is a technology conference, is it not? And so here's one of my particular heroes, Clive Sinclair. And of course, the great thing about people working in technology is there's a lot of innovation goes on. There's a lot of very bright people. There's a lot of really great people doing some really amazing work, pushing the boundaries. And I guess what we're trying to do within a sustainability context is do exactly the same thing. But when you do that, of course, what happens is sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. And sometimes your vision might outstrip the reality. And of course, Clive Sinclair, did some amazing things with the personal computers, but of course he had this vision for personal electric transport. Now, his vehicle for that was the classic C5. And of course, it didn't really take off. And of course, what's happened subsequently is we are now we are in the land of Tesla and electric vehicles really becoming, sort of part of the sort of normal landscape. But of course, the other thing about technology is that you can create something, but it has unintended consequences. And so here's some examples of other people that took a C5 and then did things with it and turned it into something else. So again, the beauty of it is that it can have, very positive unintended consequences, but clearly, there may be sort of negative consequences as well. But I think it's also been touched in one of the questions. I mean, we can talk about technology and the power of technology for transforming the world, for addressing some of these kind of significant sustainability challenges. But at the end of the day, it does come back to people, does it not? So, it's the people that, in effect, are sort of creating these innovations. It's the people that are benefiting from these innovations, the people that are using these innovations. And so I think it's, I just felt it was really important to emphasize the people bit of the technology picture, particularly when it comes to sustainability. So as a business, we have our own kind of value statements, which I think is really important as a way for us to sort of define how we approach the challenge of using technology to address, in our case, the issue of global waste. So we see ourselves as resourceful, respectful, and remarkable. And again, on that, I think the culture of the business is absolutely crucial. So as a technology company, I believe that the culture, the statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast and then technology for lunch and so on and so on is absolutely vital. So we cannot remove the culture and the people from this whole equation when we're talking about technology and sustainability. And so on that note, I'll finish, and I think we're moving on to questions. Thank you.
You are indeed, Michael. Thank you very much for that. And I'll go straight to the first question that you've already referred to. What part do you think, and obviously we're going to bring back in Betsy and Iain on this, but what part do you think a circular economy has to play in sustainability? And what problems do you foresee in having businesses adopt the mindset to actually create and deliver reusable products? So I'll put that to Betsy first.
Oh, that's a big question. Well, obviously, internally, being human and creating a structure and a culture that allows people to be human and innovative internally is really important. So building that into your leadership of encouraging your people to actually innovate based on their own personal instincts and gifts is super important. So building that into people's targets and then into giving them time to be innovative, to be human, because that's actually something that's really important as we change our working culture, particularly now that everyone works remotely. But then how that translates into external things is remembering that also your customers are human. They have real lives, they have concerns, they have children, but they also really want to see that there is positive social and environmental impact. So I think keeping that in mind when setting strategy and keeping that in the front of your mind, especially in digital innovation, never forget that it's all about humans. It's not about the tech. It's not about, we're not robots. None of us are, even those of us who work in technology. I'm the co-founder of a tech startup, by the way, so I'm experiencing this firsthand as well. So yeah, that would be my simple-ish answer to that.
Iain?
So I think it's quite interesting because I suppose as a sort of energy company, our product is effectively infinitely reusable. So I suppose in some senses, as a services provider, how do you bring that sort of thing to life? I think it's maybe a bit more straightforward if you're, in an FMCG type environment of, oh God, right, this Pringles tube is really bad. How do we go and do that? But I guess we are, we're showing leadership in terms of how we're taking on the sustainability challenge. We have a chief sustainability officer who reports to the CEO. So I suppose while we can't necessarily influence it directly, we can show, I suppose, what a great company who takes sustainability and net zero really seriously, what that looks like and kind of role model that.
Do they ever completely change tack? If you say, right, this is our aim, this is our intention, but to do that, we need this particular widget. But unfortunately, we've discovered 4 or 5 components in this that are simply not recyclable. Therefore, we can't use that widget. Therefore, we can't achieve our aims. Therefore, we'll not try to do it. Has that ever happened in your experience?
For me or for?
Yeah, for you, Iain.
I genuinely don't know. There's obviously bits of our supply chain. If you look at, there's a lot of concrete that has to be used to build wind turbines and things like that. So it's not like every aspect of it is completely sustainable. But actually, if the end product is about taking carbon out of the electricity network, then the end potentially justifies the means with that. But I guess again, if you're talking about more of a product, then there's not too many alternatives to concrete. But then when you think about the turbines, so concrete, but you're actually getting into the sort of floating turbines. So people are using innovative solutions to actually say, how do you make the carbon footprint of electricity generation far less than it is or has been traditionally?
Okay, Michael, thoughts on that?
Well, I think the discussion just pretty well sums up the difficulty of really, really creating a globally significant circular economy. And so I think, we can't look at it from one single direction, can we? So to Iain's point about, going back to the sort of materials that they need to sort of work with, designing products and designing kind of processes and goods and packaging that is fully recoverable and recyclable is really, really difficult. But clearly there's a job to be done at that end, so the design end. So when we're thinking about all of those sort of products and the materials that we're using, but also attached to that is, well, what product's better than others from a life cycle point of view? There are always sort of compromises that have to be made. So that's at the, if you like, the design end. Then you get to the other end where that material is kind of then, or those products are used. Now, some of those products traditionally will be remanufactured, so it might be motors or other assets like that. But then you've got the whole piece around sort of waste, so whether it be sort of recyclable waste or hazardous waste or construction waste, and back to my point, that volume of that material is just going to keep going up. And the problem with that is once that gets into that, what you might think of as that downstream sort of supply chain, it gets mixed, it gets contaminated. There's all sorts of sort of issues with trying to sort of follow that through the system. So if you do want to recover that material back into your production systems, it's quite difficult. And so the way we approach that is to basically say, okay, this is what's happening. So we have a platform called Waste Map, and we are literally showing companies what happens to all of that material. And once they start to see some of the distances that material travels and some of the outcomes for that material, it starts to make them think, okay, maybe we do need to sort of go back to, if you like, the source and start to think differently about it. But the question's a good one. But it is very, very difficult. But that's basically, we think if we can get better visibility over that system, we can help to build better business models, which can help to drive the circular economy.
I touched on this morning, and I'd like to bring it up again with you three, because I'm genuinely curious. I think there's a general consensus that we're on the lip of a pretty bad depression. Now, right now, we're concerning ourselves with these issues because we have the luxury of concerning ourselves with these issues. How confident are you all that we're going to carry on concerning ourselves with these issues when things get really bad?
Well, so I think it depends on where you're at, right? So, I just had a text from a friend that was watching, right? So, the investment that SSE are making, both in terms of its transmission network and in renewable energy, it eye-watering sums of money, right? It doesn't really matter what the global economy is going to be doing. Actually, we've got significant, institutional investors are moving away from pollutants and wanting, even if that's a greenwash, I don't care if you just have to greenwash, but actually if that gives us capital to go and build more, more sources of sustainable energy that we need for the country, then that's fantastic. And actually, I don't see. I think we are growing significantly, and when you take that 2.4 billion I talk about, that's probably a doubling up of what we've done over the past 5 years. So we're in a huge growth journey, and frankly, the only reason SSE does that is because it's good for the planet, but it is also good for our shareholders as well, and it creates jobs, and so in the right places, actually, doing the things that help the planet are also very good for your business outcomes as well.
Can I step in there? Because I think what I'm seeing, as opposed to the last time we had a global recession in 2008, is we're 12 years further along in it being embedded into systems. Because, the thing that stands in the way of a lot of rapid change is the systems. Procurement or just circular economy is endlessly complicated. But what you were saying, Iain, absolutely agree with that. Now, vested interests are more invested in things like renewable sources of energy, infrastructure that is more sustainable going forward. There's a momentum to it that I think can't be stopped by a recession. Actually, it is baked into a lot of business models and regulation and expectations. So I feel quite confident in saying that it's less shakeable than it would have been the last time we had a global recession, and that actually it's so necessary now, and that's so accepted at strategic level that I'm not concerned that it will slow down much.
This is maybe a bit of a too narrow a view, but there's a real view that carbon is the new cash. And actually, the accountancy standards around carbon are going to be as critical as the accountancy standards around any other aspect. So we're looking at, how we get that reporting from throughout our supply chain, so that we're able to actually say, this turbine has had, this much carbon in it, and having that full visibility through the supply chain. And I don't even know, I'm not sure, there's a number of tools available to do that, but, as a FTSE 100 company, you just have to be doing that. Like, there's no excuse not to be doing that and being concerned about the carbon in your supply chain, and then try and reduce it.
Yeah, I think that's that in many ways it's a fundamental point, isn't it? I mean, Iain, you talk about the investors. I mean, the whole idea, it must be, what time is it in Barcelona, Betsy?
It's 2 days. I tried to mute myself.
Okay, right, cool. The whole idea of, environmental and social and governance investing, ESG investing, of course, has traditionally been a bit of a sort of a minority sport, in terms of the bigger world of institutional investment. But that absolutely is totally changing. So I do think that is one of the fundamental differences between where we are now and where we were in 2008, and certainly when we were 30 years ago, when somebody said to me, go and get yourself a proper job. So I think that's a kind of key aspect. So that isn't going away. I think the idea of, and certainly in relation to the C word, which has got 19 after it, the idea of supply chains and securing your supply chains, and the idea of proper resource efficiency, which is waste is a cost. So that idea is really, really being brought to home. And so I just think the economics, or the economic argument, and whether it's triple bottom line or purely based on traditional models of financial performance, the economics are kind of absolutely stack up in the favor of taking a more sustainable approach to the way businesses operate.
Can I also build on that again? I've been working for the past 2.5 years with the largest county council in England on an innovative waste behaviour change project, because they have to make £1 million a year savings because it's their biggest expenditure as a council. I used to be the head of campaigns at Zero Waste Scotland, so it's nice to be talking about waste again. It's a comfort zone. But yeah, it's absolutely critical to make savings and they're starting to see it as such a cost that contamination, because people still don't know how to recycle properly, is a huge, huge expense for them. So that's also driving a lot of innovation, which is, to Michael's point about waste being a resource. People get it now.
Waste comes in all sorts of different forms. A question here from Steve McGowan, Scottish Enterprise, saying, Jerry McGovern's recently published a book, Worldwide Waste, on how digital is having an impact on sustainability. A key part of that relates to the creation, storage and use of data, most of which, he says, doesn't get accessed or used a few months after it's created. My question is, what do the panel think can be done to try and reduce the negative effects of data storage on the planet, and how must digital transformation program support this from day one? Who wants to take that one?
So I would, I've got a sort of couple of points on this. So I think this is absolutely incredibly valid. We have data centers within SSE, and actually as part of our kind of 5-year strategy, we want to get rid of those data centers, because actually our ability to influence how much power they use and things like that is a lot lower than actually going to somebody like Microsoft, who have a carbon negative ambition for 2030. And I think that is looking at every ounce of carbon that they've ever put into the environment, they will have offset by 2030. So actually making it somebody else's problem is quite helpful, because actually what I think this comes down to is a commercial conversation. Because actually if your business wants to store terabytes worth of data, then actually having that in somebody else's data center, where you're having a conversation about, did you know that that's cost you £100,000 a month and X, tons of carbon to store, is a lot easier than actually having your own storage, and it's just like mañana. We don't have to worry about that. So actually, I think it's a really critical thing. But cash is king in this, and that's the way to achieve it.
I admire everybody who's about to say ha mañana when there's somebody from Barcelona sitting on the panel at the same time.
It's a good one.
Do you agree with that, Betsy?
Yeah, and actually in all the work I have done on selling this to business or government leaders, or even behaviour change. Well, I used to run the National Food Waste Campaign in Scotland, and the selling point was always, this is how much money you're throwing away by throwing away a third of your food. And it's no different when you talk to business leaders or the government. And yeah, I completely agree.
I think it's a really good question about the amount of data that's generated that doesn't get used. I mean, there's a great story about one of the very early radar satellites that created so much data that they didn't have the capacity to actually process it. So, So I think there is a question there about what we collect and how we collect it and why we collect it. And I think there are issues there with the ethics of data and everything else, which we maybe do or do not want to go into. But on the point about the storage and the hosting and everything else, I mean, I think Iain's point. I mean, all the platform players are trying to do that. I mean, Google are certainly going down a sort of carbon neutral group, and they're using their own AI capability to reduce the energy use and make those kind of data centers much more efficiently using AI and machine learning. So that's quite an interesting one. I think it also comes back to why are we doing that, and is the benefit of collecting that data and hosting that data actually giving us, are we getting greater benefit in terms of the environmental and the social outcomes for hosting that material? So again, there's always a compromise, is there not, when it comes to sort of talking about sustainability? There are different things at play there. So we've got to sort of look at the ultimate benefit of using some energy to drive those, data centers, but what could that data and that analysis actually do in terms of the bigger picture when it comes to some of these kind of global sustainability challenges? So it's a sort of trade-off scenario, I think.
When I was previously working in the sort of energy supply part of that's now Oval, if you look at the data that's being created by smart meters, there is petabytes of data on smart meters that potentially, like, there's this whole, we should store it because it'll be incredible and we can gamify people and we can incentivize people to save energy. It's all sitting there, and from a regulatory perspective, you're not allowed to market from it. You're not allowed to do anything commercial with it. So it is just sitting there getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and nobody really has any idea what to do with it. So it's like...
What's the point of the smart meters then?
Oh, exactly. I mean, there's a whole sort of like balancing and settlement that allows you to sort of, dynamically control demand, but actually in terms of even the near-term behavior or the long-term behavior, I genuinely don't think they know what they want to do with it. So, but they're just collecting it, and as I say, once every half an hour, the DCC has got 10 million meter reads.
You all touched on this in different ways. I mean, Michael, you spoke about the fact that there's never just one source of the truth. And a lot of the things you said, Betsy, it kind of boiled down for me to, trust is key. If we're going to have people mediating for us or dealing on our behalf, we have to be able to trust them. That's, I think, it's a vanishing supply. Folk are, I think, a lot less trustworthy now than they perhaps might have been 10, 15 years ago. Do you agree with that, the three of you?
I'll let you go first.
Well, it depends, doesn't it? It depends how far back you go in history, doesn't it, Mark? I mean, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but if you go back 200-300 years, was there any more trust in the powers that be at that point? I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, trust is, I guess what we're trying to do, I mean, I can only talk about our experience, but we'll talk about what we're trying to do in relation to resources and waste material. There is very little trust in what's publicly available in terms of sort of the data. So what we're trying to do is provide a view into that system that has a defined level of confidence attached to what you might be looking at, and how we've arrived at those kind of calculations is a known thing. So we're trying to provide we're trying to build the trust that way by being a little bit more, I suppose, transparent and analytical and understandable in relation to that particular type of data. But that isn't necessarily going to assuage everybody's concerns.
I see it as quite cyclical. I think a lot of it is people learning to trust the new sources of information and then kind of getting used to it, and then they're maybe being corrupted. And I think we're at the end of the cycle where actually now we have a real opportunity to build trust by, being more transparent, being more authentic, and actually backing up words with actions and data. I think data is super important for that. And people, people are not dumb, and people are confused, and they do want to be able to trust their sources of information. And I think data is going to be key for that, and backing up anything that we say publicly, so we avoid greenwashing or purpose washing or any of the other washing going on right now. But yeah, people aren't dumb. They look under the surface now. They're getting quite savvy.
Yeah, I do think that, you know, maybe it goes back before 2008, but I think there's been a huge erosion of trust in just any sort of big organizations, you know, whether that's government, the church, the banks, things that people used to put a great level of faith in, through various scandals and you know, awful human behavior, like people don't trust. I think one of the answers here is, as Betsy says, you know, not just data, but open data. And actually, you know, one of the things that's trying to reestablish trust in banking is open banking, and this ability to, you know, actually your data is yours and you can have it used how you want. And we've got the Energy Data Task Force that's kind of driving the same thing. And, you know, you've got sort of like GDPR and privacy by design on one hand, and then open data on the other hand. And we have to kind of find the right balance. But fundamentally, if we look at what other energy companies are doing across the world, you know, if you go on Fingrid's website in Finland, you can see exactly what they're producing at any point. And actually, I think open as standard is probably the way that we're going to need to go. But there's a big cultural change for business to get their head around that.
Okay, this question's come in, I think, aimed primarily at Michael, or possibly not, I don't know. This is from Lee Wilson in the Bay Centre. He says, I really like Michael's point that waste is a cost, because from a systems thinking perspective, that's true. But sometimes the cost can be borne by parties who don't create the waste. What type of changes would you like to see in order for the creators of waste to be incentivized to take responsibility for its reduction or eradication? Or do you think that shifting tides in consumer perspectives and investor appetites is sufficient to drive the change needed? Discuss.
Well, the latter are the external factors and external drivers on the waste producer. But basically, we start with the waste producer. So we start with the organizations that are producing that waste and putting that waste out into the world and into the system. And the reason we do that is because, number one, they've got the incentive. You know, they have the opportunity to either reduce the cost attached to sort of processing or doing something with that material, to actually recover some of that material and bring that back into production systems, to reduce the risks attached to not knowing what happens to that material, because there is the concept of producer responsibility that is a live thing, and it applies to, you know, certain materials in a certain legal ways. But it generally is a thing that, if you look at the new waste strategy in the UK, you know, the idea of producer responsibility is going to have a lot more teeth. So increasingly, those producers are incentivized either commercially and economically, or through sort of risk and going back to Betsy's point about reputation. Because if your waste ends up, you know, on a beach in Turkey or Malaysia, that's not brilliant from a sort of reputational point of view. And reputation, if you're a listed company, feeds into sort of market value. So there are sort of real risks attached to that. There are risks attached to greenhouse gas emissions reporting by not really sort of being able to understand, you know, what's happening around sort of materials and byproducts. So there's a whole range of different reasons why you've got to go back to the waste producer, which is where we would concentrate. So I think the waste producer, you know, there's a lot of play there for those guys.
Can I step in there? Because in for the 2016 or 2017, I ran the campaign in Scotland, Have You Got the Bottle?, to advocate the Scottish Government to introduce a deposit return system for waste packaging, because it's a proven way to incentivize consumers, I hate the term, but people who buy this stuff to actually return their packaging, because there's a financial incentive. And it was useful to have the government finally on board for that, because producers didn't really want to take responsibility. There was a lot of lip service in the packaging industry and the drinks industry about their sustainability credentials, but actually they wanted to be left alone to continue just creating packaging without having to buy into the system, which actually pays for itself. So it was a really interesting view into, sometimes it is still very useful to see the government take leadership on producer responsibility. And I think, yeah, with the UK government waste strategy, which is England and Wales only, obviously, they actually have added some teeth, because obviously, voluntary agreements are very popular in the UK and the US, whereas here in Europe, I have seen a lot more, they're not so much about voluntary agreements. They kind of make people do things. So, and that will drive a real reduction in packaging, because I've done so much consumer behavior change work over the years that I've gotten frustrated with seeing the behaviors put at the feet of people who actually, the responsibility should be put onto the people putting packaging out there into the environment in the first place. So personal stance, but also just from an actual reduction of impact, it's really important. And it's not popular, and there are vested interests in lobbying against it. So sometimes we need a little bit of that ecosystem of change to help push it a bit. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I think the post-consumer packaging is the thing that gets all the attention here. But of course, we mustn't forget there's more kind of commercial, industrial, hazardous construction waste that's being generated, in that context. We see the packaging, obviously, because we are consumers and therefore we put in that in our bins. But in terms of the volume of that material, there's a lot more volume happening elsewhere. So we need to look at it from that point of view as well. I think the UK government is, in terms of the waste, there's a digital waste tracking system that will be UK wide. So SEPA and Scotland are involved in that as well. So that will be a mandatory system that will track all waste across the UK. And I think to the point about the consumer product companies, I think that is starting to change, definitely. I mean, we're certainly working with the likes of BrewDog and Coca-Cola, who have said they want to know what's happening to all that post-consumer material because they want to recover. And one of the problems they've all had is that waste system is so difficult to unpick. It's like, how can they possibly understand where that material is? And that is now starting to change as well.
It's so incredibly complex. I think that's what everybody needs to appreciate. This is why once you get into waste, you never get out, because it's endlessly fascinating and complex, and circular economy is mind-blowing. But yeah, it's at the point where maybe we'll see that virgin materials, things like packaging, are actually continuing to be more expensive than circular economy. Reusing things, recycling things, but it remains to be seen. It'll be interesting to see what this recession we seem to be heading into does for circular economy.
Any thoughts, Iain?
I was just thinking that we sort of lost the iconic 20 pence deposit on a glass bottle of Iron Brew in Scotland, and it's quite weird that that's now ahead of its time, and it'll probably come back at some point.
Absolutely.
July 2021, actually.
Yeah. And the idea of industrial
fun games you can have wandering up and down hedgerows, finding bottles.
Exactly.
We used to spend days doing that when I was a kid. Listen, folks, thank you all very much for that. I'm going to round it up there. Michael Gross, Betsy Reed, and Iain Dugan. Fascinating presentations all, and thanks very much for answering those questions.
Thank you for having me.
And there, essentially, I'm going to round up this conference. I'm just going to finish by thanking all of our speakers there. There's been some very interesting presentations throughout the day. I'd also like to thank our conference partners, the exhibitors and the sponsors. As I've said before, really without their assistance and help and input, these events simply wouldn't be possible. The exhibition zone is going to remain open until about 4:30 this afternoon. So if you haven't already visited the exhibition stands and met the sponsors, that was a good time to do it. There is quite a few possible prizes at competitions involved in that. So, they're not attempting to snare you. It's not for the unwary. You're perfectly wary. Go and have a shifty at it, because there's some good stuff in amongst that. If you get the chance, please fill in the conference survey. That's from Digit, and give us your feedback, whether it's positive or negative or whatever. Any ideas, any suggestions, we're absolutely open to ideas. There's a chance there to win one of two £50 Amazon gift vouchers. And on-demand content of today's sessions will be available shortly. So that's any of the slides or graphs or anything that's come up throughout the day. If we've got access to it, you will have access to it shortly. Can I just point out some of Digit's upcoming events? The next virtual conferences are Data Protection. That's on the 10th of December. There's a brand new one, Martech, on the 24th of February. That's in 2021. Brand new event for people working in marketing, tech, and management roles. Scott Secure, which is our biggie, that's the cybersecurity event, and that's on the 24th and the 25th of March. All those events are free. Registration is open for these conferences, and you can secure a place by visiting the Digit booth in the exhibition hall, which, as I say, is open till about 4:30 this afternoon. Finally, a big thank you to you for taking the time to attend this virtual conference. I hope you found it useful. As I said, any comments on it at all, if you could just stick it into the feedback forum, we would be very much obliged. I'm Mark Stephen. Thank you very much for your attention. Good afternoon.